A term you might hear in your philosophy classes is conceptual analysis, and this video will tell you more about what that is. So first, a conceptual analysis, it's helpful to think of it as it's kind of like a definition, although the term definition is a little misleading, as will become clear in just a minute. It's better to think of it as a description of constituent properties of a complex property. So you've got some complex property, and you might think whenever that complex property is had by something, really what's happening is that thing has a lot of simpler properties, sort of all together in some kind of relationship. Both of these points will be clearer with an example. So take this. This is the standard form of an analysis. X is a triangle, is defined as X is a shape with exactly 3 sides. Now, on the surface, it looks like what we're doing is defining the word triangle, the English word triangle. Now that might be true in some sense, but whenever a philosopher offers an analysis, typically they think they're doing something a little bit more than just that. They think that they're saying something about the nature of the property that our English word picks out. So there's this property, we'll call it being triangular, that this word triangle picks out. And when we give an analysis like this, we're saying something about the nature of that property. Namely, that complex property, being a triangle, is in some sense constituted by the properties over here on the right-hand side. You know, like being a shape and being a shape with certain kinds of features like this. Another kind of analysis is, here's another example. X is a bachelor is defined as X is an unmarried male. Again, it looks like we are in some sense defining the word bachelor, but people who do conceptual analysis tend to think that they're doing something a little bit more than just defining the word. They think they're saying something about the property that is picked out by our word bachelor, and namely that property has a certain kind of relationship to these properties over here, being unmarried and being male. In philosophy, you'll encounter this all the time. For example, in ethical theory, you might try to analyze the concept of being morally permissible. And here's an example of a kind of Kantian moral theory that you might discuss in an ethical theory class. But again, there's this property that actions can have, being morally permissible. And what you do when you give an analysis is you say what's really going on when an act is morally permissible is that it has these features over here. Now, some other things about conceptual analysis that I don't have on the chart here. You want these things to be not circular, so you wouldn't want to define bachelor by using the term bachelor. That's not really an analysis. You would want these things to be informative, so the idea is if you've got a property on the left-hand side that you're analyzing, you want to make sure that the properties on the right-hand side sort of illuminate the concept in some way, so that it helps you understand what it is you're dealing with. And also, you wouldn't want to have any counterexamples. You wouldn't want to be able to come up with or imagine a possible scenario where something was, say, morally permissible, but didn't meet or satisfy this side here. So that's what a conceptual analysis is. Why don't we say something about why care? Well, one, you might think that conceptual analysis is just a useful tool to helping you understand reality. If you have the view that reality has at least 2 major fundamental kinds, things and the properties they have, then part of understanding the nature of reality would be understanding the nature of the properties that things have, and conceptual analysis is, hopefully a way to try and do that. It also might help you identify criterion for when concepts apply. So this won't always be the case, and I'm going to talk more about that in just a second, but take ethical theory, for example. You might think that one useful reason to come up with an analysis of being morally permissible is that you would then be able to apply that analysis to cases of particular kinds of actions that are controversial, like, say, abortion, euthanasia. And if you look at abortion or euthanasia and think about, what the concept of moral permissibility involves, you might be able to come up with some kind of criterion to help you decide, in particular cases of action, whether it's right or wrong. Conceptual analysis will also help us eliminate ambiguity and confusion. If you're going on and on and on talking about a certain kind of concept, say person is a person, and someone else is going on and on using that same concept is a person, if you've both done your conceptual analysis homework and have thought carefully about what that is, what it is to be a person, it might make it easier for you to spot potential ambiguity or confusion where, maybe it would be easy to see that you're talking past one another, because when you thought about what it meant to be a person and when they thought about what it meant to be a person, you realize that one of you has elements in that analysis that the other one doesn't. So it's just a way to sort of make philosophical dialogue go a bit more smoothly if everybody's thinking carefully about what these important concepts really are. Conceptual analysis is also going to help you sort through theoretical commitments. What I mean by that is when when you go on and on about something and let's say you say that you think something's morally wrong, and someone says, "Oh, morally wrong? I don't know that's a weird, mysterious, spooky sort of property." If you've thought carefully about what that is, you might be in a position to say, "No, I'm not committed to anything that theoretically suspicious or mysterious, because all morality is this thing over here, and you don't think there's anything spooky or mysterious about this thing over here, so you shouldn't think there's anything spooky or mysterious about something being morally wrong." So providing illuminating analyses of concepts in terms of things that people understand and accept and are willing to grant are real might help you. It also helps you identify if any of your concepts really do hinge on something that is kind of spooky and mysterious and you can't analyze those away any further. And it just helps us think through what we should think about the nature of reality. So there's another sort of reason. Okay, I said that analyses might help us identify criterion, but it's important to distinguish analyses from criterion. So a criterion might be a guide, or a criteria might be a guide, and an analysis tells us what something is essentially. We'll use Bachelor as an example. So you might have criterion for helping you identify bachelors, but then that could be different from what it is to essentially be a bachelor. For it to be an analysis, it's got to apply to absolutely anything that's a bachelor, if it's an adequate analysis of a bachelor. It also has to be necessarily true. Analyses are supposed to identify the essential constituents of the thing that you're analyzing. And whatever these constituents are going to sort of always, not only necessarily, but be eternally true of the thing. It's not going to be a time at which something is this and is not a bachelor, but is that thing and is a bachelor if whatever that thing is part of the analysis, or is the entire analysis. And an analysis is a success if true, even if no one adopts it. It doesn't matter. This isn't a matter of convention. At least it's not supposed to be. The idea is that analyses identify mind-independent, objective facts about relations between properties and these constituent properties. This might all make more sense with an example. So, suppose you meet a guy who goes out on a lot of dates. That might be a good criterion for identifying a bachelor, but of course the guy could be a sleaze and going out on dates even though he's married. So it's not essential to being a bachelor that you go out on a lot of dates. An analysis of being a bachelor would probably be something more like being an unmarried male. So you can see the analysis here probably does meet our criterion, or our list over here, but the criterion here doesn't necessarily. Let's do another example. If something's a drinkable, clear liquid, that might be a good criterion for identifying whether or not it's water. Maybe you got to add a few more things in there. But that might not be essential to what it is to be water. Arguably, what's essential to being water is being constituted by H2O molecules, or something like that. That's a little controversial, but let's just assume that's right for the purposes of this example. Okay, so the reason I'm going on and on about this is it's sometimes tempting for some people to reject an analysis if it fails to be a good criterion. But the point is, analyses don't always have to be good criterion. It could be that you've identified the essential nature of something, but that puts you in no position to use that analysis to identify examples of it in the wild. And this H2O example is a good one to think about, right? It might be that water really is essentially H2O, but that could be of no help in identifying water in the wild, right? Like, you and I probably aren't very good at looking under a microscope or finding some liquid and putting it under a microscope and seeing if it really is made of H2O molecules. We use other methods to identify whether it's water, even though it might be the case that what water really essentially is H2O. All right. Now I want to say something about conceptual primitives. And it's helpful to walk through an example. So take knowledge. That's something that philosophers sometimes try to analyze. And here's what's called the traditional analysis of knowledge. S knows P just in case S has a justified true belief that P. Now, once you give an analysis of something, you're going to notice, like, wait a second, I've got these concepts over here. But then you might start wondering, well, what are those concepts? We've got truth, we've got belief, we've got justified. You might want to try and understand the essential nature of those things. So you could go on to analyze the concepts that are part of your analysis. So let's look at justification. Some people analyze justification in the following way. They say that being justified is just a matter of being best supported by your evidence. But then you might think, well, oh man, look, we got more concepts here, best supported and evidence. And you might start to wonder, well, do those things have analyses as well? And at this point, you might start to get a little worried that this could go on infinitely. Or you might start to worry that, well, this could go in a circle. But neither of those seem like really good options for really getting at a kind of understanding of the world, right? So another kind of option might be that, well, that there's some end to this, that you don't really have to go on and on and on and define your concepts ad infinitum or get stuck in a circle. Maybe there are some concepts that we just understand what they are, even though they don't have any informative analysis. And if you're in that camp, if you accept that there's some kind of end, or there's going to be this class of special concepts, then you accept the idea that there are conceptual primitives. And a lot of people who do conceptual analysis really do think this, that there are these conceptual primitives. And in almost any of my classes, when we're doing conceptual analysis, we will probably talk about somebody who's taken the primitive route with respect to that concept. So let's just outline some unofficial rules. Sometimes it looks like treating a concept as a primitive is a kind of philosophical cheat, or it's like you're sticking your head in the sand. So I think it's important to note that philosophers don't just do this willy-nilly. There are some rules or guidelines to being able to treat something as a primitive. One thing that people tend to require before they treat something as a primitive is they got to be able to point out clear instances of it. It's got to be very clear that you're tracking some property in the world. So, for example, some philosophers think that you can't analyze life. To say what it is to be a living organism, there is no informative analysis of that. But they think, well, look, but it's pretty obvious when things are and are not alive. So, that's a case where you would say, look, I can point out a clear instance here. There have to be repeated failures of analyses usually, because that's just evidence that you're dealing with something that can't be analyzed. So usually before a philosopher will treat something as a primitive, they will go to some lengths to show you, look, all of these analyses, there's been tons and tons of attempts, and they've just all failed. They never quite capture whatever this concept is. And generally, there's a rule that the fewer primitives you have in your worldview, the better. So you're just not allowed to help yourself to primitives all over the place. You have to really try and get that stock of primitives down to as few as possible. Um, Now, when you understand this, I hope it will help um, eliminate some frustration that I think some people encounter when they read philosophy. So I'm just, as an aside, I'm going to note something. Often when you read philosophy, you'll see somebody give a definition of something. So, definition 1, blah. And then they'll show you that there's a counterexample to it. And then they say, well, we were close with definition 1. Maybe the proper definition is definition 2, blah, blah. But then they say, you know what? That's not going to work. Here's a counterexample. And then they give you definition 3, blah, blah, blah. And then they show you there's a counterexample. And then definition 4, blah, 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 blah. And then they give you a counterexample. And then they're like, you know what? This messing around with blahs, that's just not working. So let's try a different strategy. Rat-a-tat-tat is definition 5. And this could go on and on and on and on. And at some point, you might get really frustrated and say, man, this is just so irritating and annoying and frustrating. Why are we going through all these tedious definitions? Well, I think at least part of it is, if you're going to treat something as a primitive, you have to have done some due diligence to show that, analyses really do fail. There just really is no plausible option. So you have to go through and consider lots of options. So when you encounter a philosopher going through all the possible options for analyzing something, they're sort of just doing their homework. This is sort of a kind of due diligence that we feel somewhat obliged to go through before we can treat something as a primitive. So investigating whether or not something can be appropriately treated as a primitive at least involves that long, tedious process of definition. So I hope that this is particularly true in one of the books that I read or have my students read in my classes, and this is a complaint that they often have. So I thought it would be good to just note that at the end of this little discussion on conceptual analysis. Okay, there's more to be said about conceptual analysis, but I think that's a good starter video.